Now it is possible to nest an if statement inside another if statement, sometimes referred to as double if and triple if. Now this can be extremely useful. If we take the nested ifs working file, you'll see on the ages sheet we already have in place the if statement that we used earlier, where it says if the person's age is greater than 45, then they are getting on a bit. If not, they're quite young. If, however, you wanted to have a scale of ages, so we're looking at if they're over 45, they're getting on a bit. But what happens if they're over 65? We wanted to add a bit more information about those or add a different message. Then what we can do is effectively replace one of the sections, so here's the true bit, with another complete if statement. So it would add an if, it would have an open bracket, it would have an evaluation, and it would have a true and a false. So let's remove the getting on a bit, and in its place, add an if statement. Now, the nested if doesn't need an equal sign. Only the original one, the starting one, does. So we start away with if, open brackets, B2 is greater than 65, comma. So if they're greater than 65, then they are very ancient. Close speech marks. That's my true section, comma, my false bit. So this is they're not greater than 65. But don't forget they've already entered this equation being greater than 45. So we'll put that as getting on, and then close brackets, close my nested if. So this whole if statement here sits inside the true evaluation for the outer if. So the outer if firstly asks if they're greater than 45. If they are, we go into the true section, and then the true section then takes us down another route of asking another if statement. It says, oh, okay, so if they're greater than 65, having already been greater than 45, then they are very ancient. If not, therefore they are over 45 but under 65, then they're simply getting on. However, if they're not even over 45, they end up in the false section here, which is the quite young. Now we could put another if statement in here, so that they were asking another question, effectively on the downward route of those ages. And there's nothing to stop you effectively even changing that true section for another if statement. You can actually embed 64 levels of if in Excel 2013. Whether you would want to or not is a different matter, but the physical capability is there. Obviously, you need to watch your logical path as you do this, and the more you add in, you have to be careful that you're not negating one of the options by the questions that you ask. So I'm asking greater than 45. If so, then I can then ask greater than 65, so that the false part is actually greater than that, but less than that. Let's see if that works. Still quite young is Bob. Let's replicate the formula. And we see that the two that are over 65 now become very ancient. Not be too long before I get there myself. So that's a nested if. We can see this in action again with the score sheet. Now here you'll see some dancers and their exam scores, and then their grade is based on their exam percentage. Looking at this little table here. So if they reach 55, they're a pass. If they exceed that and get to 85, they're a merit. If they exceed that and get to 90, they get a distinction. So equals if. So if Jill's score in this case is greater than or equal to 55%, then they get a pass. So you see I'm referencing the cells this time. If not, then they get a fail, which doesn't actually have a cell. So we'll type that in. Well, that sort of covers us in that Jill's failed because she hasn't reached the 55. If we then use our absolute on the J1 and the I1 before we replicate, we find that most people have passed, but Zoe has failed, but we're not picking up those that have merits and distinctions. So we go back to our original if, and let's change this section here, the true section. So they've got more than 45. Excellent. So our next step is to replace this whole true statement with another if. So they have more than the 45. So we're into the true section here. Let's ask if B2 is then greater than or equal to the merit score. If it is, then we actually need to ask the next if, which is are they greater than or equal to distinction. So that's if, open brackets, B2 is greater than or equal to distinction. If they are, then they get the distinction label. If not, then they get the merit label. Close that if. But that whole if statement is only the true value for the previous if. So the false value for the previous if is pass. That closes that if statement. So that if statement there, as a question, a true and a false, is actually part of the next if statement up in the chain, where we have a question, a true and a false, which is then part of effectively the original if statement. So if I then dollar up, add in the absoluteness, all the references to our little scoring table, so we can then copy this formula. The B2 must remain relative, so that's always looking at the new person's score. Jill still failed. Sorry, Jill. We replicate the formula and we see that Sally actually has distinction, which she does. She's over 90. And we have 3 merits, distinction and fail. Now, the logic has fallen over somewhere because 56% should not be a merit. Let's revisit our logic. So if B2 is greater than J1, then we need to find out if they've gone over the merit score, or equal to or over the merit score. If they have, then we need to find out if they've gone over the distinction score. So if they have, they get a distinction label. If they haven't, they get a merit label. So they've still gone over the merit score. If they haven't gone over the merit score, then they get a pass. So the logic is fine. What is wrong is the absolute referencing here. J2 needs to be absolute referenced as well, because that's a result in the table. So we re-replicate our formula and find that they now fall into the pass section. We do have a merit and a distinction and then a fail at the end. So the logic then works. But obviously the if statement there really has got quite complicated with 2 nested ifs inside a main if. There are other ways of doing a similar thing to this that possibly could be deemed slightly easier to follow the logic for, and we will look at those later, and that is the VLOOKUP. So nested ifs are achievable. You've got to be very careful of your logic, but you could, in theory, go down to 64 levels of nested if.